Could a simple gesture really influence the way your energy organizes itself in your daily life? Hardly anyone talks about it, but there's evidence that certain movements, repeated over time, can alter your focus, intention, and even how you react to opportunities. This isn't some mystical or automatic process, and maybe that's why the care involved is so rarely discussed. The question that remains is, how can a seemingly harmless gesture change perception and results so drastically? And before we continue, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below telling me what you think about this. If you feel that your life is stuck and you want to change that, I explained it more calmly in a guide I left in the pinned comment. Stop for a moment and notice something you may have never seen before. In the most well-known images of spiritual figures, Christ giving a blessing, Buddha meditating, Seraphim of Sarov in prayer, there is a detail that repeats with almost impossible precision. Their hands, not just the general position, but the exact way each finger is placed, as if they were following identical instructions left in some manual lost to time. You can check this right now. Look up any traditional depiction of these figures and observe. The thumb lightly touching the index finger, the other fingers curved in a specific way, the palm facing a particular direction. It's as if artists from completely different cultures, separated by continents and centuries, all had access to the same set of rules. This should bother us a little, because artistic coincidences of this magnitude simply don't happen when we're talking about traditions preserved for millennia, especially when those traditions deal with what each culture considers most sacred. Some ancient records suggest these gestures weren't just decorative symbols or artistic conventions. There was, apparently, a practical reason for each position, a function. Manuscripts preserved over centuries indicate that these hand positions were considered tools, instruments capable of influencing both the person performing them and the person observing them. But here we start to enter territory that our formal education rarely explores. Because if these gestures had a real function, it would mean that generations of artists, scribes, and guardians of spiritual traditions dedicated their lives to preserving something that worked. Not just something beautiful or symbolic, but something effective. The word mudra appears in ancient Sanskrit texts with a very specific meaning. It doesn't just mean gesture, as many simplified translations suggest. The more accurate translation would be seal or key, as if each hand position were literally a key capable of opening or closing something internal. The preserved Vedic texts speak of these keys as if they were a form of technology, precise instructions for accessing specific states of the body and mind. This leads us to a question we rarely ask. Why the hands? Why not the feet, the shoulders, or any other part of the body? There are clues in ancient manuscripts that the hands were considered points of convergence, places where different internal systems met and could be regulated. Oral traditions, preserved in different parts of the world, speak of the hands as miniature maps of the entire body. Each finger, each joint, each point on the palm was said to correspond to specific organs, systems, and functions, not as an abstract theory, but as practical knowledge passed down from teacher to student over generations. And here we find something interesting. Historical records indicate that this knowledge wasn't exclusive to the East. Texts preserved in the Orthodox Christian tradition, especially those related to the Desert Fathers and the first monasteries, contain references to specific hand positions during prayer, not just to symbolize reverence, but to induce specific states of concentration and inner peace. The tradition of Seraphim of Sarov, for example, includes detailed instructions on how to position the hands during different types of prayer. Instructions that, when compared with Buddhist or Hindu texts from the same era, show similarities that go beyond coincidence. as if different traditions had accessed the same discoveries about how the human body really works. But perhaps the most intriguing part is discovering that this perspective on the hands hasn't completely disappeared from Western culture. It was just, let's say, reinterpreted over time. The expression, "it's all in your hands," for example. Have you ever stopped to think about the literal origin of that phrase? Some ancient texts suggest it wasn't metaphorical. It was a technical statement about how the conscious control of the hands could influence health, mental state, and even life events. Modern first responders still use specific points on the hands in emergency situations, stimulating the base of the pinky fingernail for cardiac emergencies, for example, massaging specific points on the palm to relieve different types of pain. These techniques appeared in first aid manuals without much explanation of their origin, but when you compare these points with the hand maps preserved in ancient texts, the correspondences are stunning. Traditional Chinese medicine mapped these correspondences with extraordinary detail. Each finger is connected to specific organs, the thumb to the stomach and spleen, the index finger to the kidneys, the middle finger to the liver and gallbladder, the ring finger to the lungs and intestines, and the pinky to the heart and small intestine. Not as theory, but as a practice tested over thousands of years on millions of people. And here we reach a point where things get really interesting. Because modern science, after decades of dismissing these maps as superstition, has begun to find physical evidence that something is actually there. Structures in the connective tissue that correspond exactly to the channels described in ancient texts. Lines of lower electrical resistance that follow the same paths mapped by traditional practitioners. A Korean biochemist named Kim Bong-han documented these structures back in the 20th century, but his work was largely forgotten for decades, until more recent researchers began to confirm his findings using technologies he didn't have access to. Apparently, there is indeed a physical network in the body that corresponds to the energy channels described in ancient manuscripts. This changes everything, because if there is a real physical basis for these channels, then mudras stop being symbolic gestures and become, well, precision tools, ways to consciously influence systems that normally operate automatically. But we need to be careful here, because it's easy to fall into the trap of thinking we completely understand something just because we've found a scientific explanation for it. The ancient texts on mudras didn't just talk about physical influence on the body. They spoke of levels of effect that go far beyond what current science can measure or explain. Preserved manuscripts describe practitioners capable of influencing not only their own health, but the environment around them, states of consciousness where the distinction between the practitioner and the external world became less clear. Accounts of people who, through mastery of these techniques, could affect the weather, the health of others, and even events that seemed completely random. Does that sound impossible? Maybe. But it's worth remembering that many of the technologies we use today would have seemed impossible to people just 100 years ago. And the records of these advanced effects of mudras don't come from one or two isolated sources. They appear consistently in traditions separated by thousands of miles and hundreds of years. The question isn't whether we should believe everything written in these ancient texts. The question is whether we should completely ignore knowledge that was preserved with such care by so many different generations, especially when parts of that knowledge are already starting to find scientific confirmation. So what really happens when someone positions their hands according to the instructions preserved in these manuscripts? The texts describe specific rules that must be followed. It's not enough to just copy the position. There's an entire protocol: warming up the hands, correct spinal posture, specific breathing patterns, minimum practice duration, and the proper emotional state. It's as if the ancient practitioners had developed a true science of mudras, with methodology, controls, and measurable results. The preserved texts include detailed descriptions of how each mudra should be performed, how long it should last, and what signs would indicate that the technique was working correctly. And here, we find something that should make us pause and reflect. Because if these instructions were just superstition or ritual with no real basis, why would they have been preserved with such precision? Why would generations of practitioners have dedicated their lives to keeping this information intact? Why would completely separate cultures have developed such similar systems independently? Perhaps the answer lies in the fact that these gestures actually worked. Not necessarily in the magical or supernatural way that some texts suggest, but in some real, measurable way, a way that we are only just beginning to understand with the tools of modern science. But there's something more specific we need to examine, something that the preserved manuscripts describe in almost technical detail. Because the ancient traditions didn't just talk about mudras in general, they catalogued specific gestures, each with very defined purposes, as if it were a pharmacy of gestures, where each remedy had its precise indication. And here we find records that deserve careful attention. Preserved texts describe 5 main mudras, each associated with the fundamental elements that, according to these traditions, make up all of existence, not as abstract philosophy, but as a practical system for influencing specific bodily functions. The first is called the Earth Mudra. The texts describe a technique where the ring finger touches the base of the thumb, while the other fingers remain extended. Ancient records suggest that this position would influence blood circulation, strengthen bones, and promote what they called energetic stability. People who practiced this mudra reported faster recovery from injuries and greater overall physical stamina. It's interesting to note that modern massage therapists, without knowing these ancient traditions, have discovered that stimulating these exact points on the hand does indeed improve circulation. A coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe the ancient practitioners mapped something that modern science is just now rediscovering. The second is known as the Life Mudra. Here, the thumb simultaneously touches the ring and pinky fingers, while the other fingers remain extended. Preserved texts indicate that this position would activate what they called the life force, increasing energy, strengthening the immune system, improving vision, and reducing mental fatigue. Records from ancient monasteries mention monks who practiced this mudra regularly and rarely got sick, even during epidemics. And here, we need to take an important pause, because this specific mudra appears in Orthodox Christian icons. The traditional gesture of blessing, where 2 fingers join the thumb, is anatomically identical to the life mudra, described in Eastern texts. This shouldn't surprise us so much. Maybe it should make us question whether the knowledge of energetic gestures wasn't far more universal than we imagine. The third is the water mudra. The thumb touches the pinky finger, and the others remain extended. Ancient manuscripts suggest that this position would regulate bodily fluids, maintain proper hydration, and improve skin health. Preserved texts describe how practitioners in desert regions use this mudra to maintain their water balance in extreme conditions. These accounts may sound fantastic, but they make more sense when we consider that the human body is 70% water and that small changes in the nervous system can indeed affect fluid retention. The fourth is called the air mudra. The index finger bends to touch the base of the thumb, which then rests on top of it. The texts describe this position as specifically effective for reducing anxiety, stress, and impatience. Preserved traditions indicate that this mudra was taught to students before important exams or to warriors before battles. The goal was to restore what they called mental equilibrium. Interestingly, modern medicine has discovered that stimulating certain points on the hand does in fact release neurotransmitters that reduce stress. Again, coincidence or preserved knowledge. The fifth is the Sun Mudra. Here, the ring finger bends to touch the base of the thumb. Ancient records suggest that this position would influence what they called the digestive fire, stimulating metabolism, protecting the heart, and aiding in fat burning. Preserved texts mention that this mudra was practiced by people who needed to maintain physical fitness for intense activities. But there's something important that these texts always emphasize. Mudras are not a medical treatment. They were seen as a supplement, never as a substitute for proper healthcare. A distinction that the ancient traditions made clearly and that perhaps we should keep in mind. Now here we find something that might challenge our Western perspective on spirituality, because these gestures weren't exclusive to Eastern traditions. There is documentary evidence that similar systems existed in the Christian West, particularly in the Eastern monastic traditions and the teachings of the Desert Fathers. Seraphim of Sarov, for example, didn't just use specific hand gestures during his prayers. He taught exact positions to his disciples with detailed instructions on breathing, posture, and duration. Instructions that, when examined carefully, show remarkable correspondences with the techniques described in Hindu and Buddhist texts from the same period. This suggests something interesting. Maybe these techniques aren't Eastern or Western. Maybe they are simply human. Knowledge about how the body works that was discovered independently by different cultures and then adapted to their respective spiritual traditions. And here we arrive at a concept that might seem even stranger to a modern Western perspective: the chakras. Preserved texts describe these energy centers not as abstract mystical concepts, but as specific points in the body where different systems intersect, like major junctions in a complex network. Ancient records suggest there are 7 main centers, each corresponding to specific glands and organs, not as theory, but as a practical mapping of the human body, and mudras were considered tools to regulate the flow of energy between these centers. This might sound completely fantastic, but it's worth considering that modern medicine recognizes the human body as fundamentally an electrochemical system. Our nerves function through electrical impulses. Our heart generates measurable electromagnetic fields. Our cells communicate through chemical and electrical signals. If the body is naturally an energetic system, then it's not impossible that ancient techniques discovered ways to consciously influence these systems. Ways that we are only just beginning to understand with modern scientific instruments. Devices like electrocardiograms and MRIs have been measuring bodily frequencies for decades, and recent studies suggest that the points traditionally identified as chakras coincide with areas of high bioelectric activity, concentrations of nerve plexuses, endocrine glands, and measurable electromagnetic fields. But regardless of whether we believe in the literal existence of chakras, there is something practical we can observe. People who practice mudras regularly, following the instructions preserved in ancient texts, report consistent effects: improved sleep, reduced stress, greater mental clarity, better digestion. Could these effects be a placebo? It's possible, but the placebo effect itself is a fascinating phenomenon. It demonstrates that the mind has a real ability to influence the body. And if mudras work, even if it's just through the placebo effect, that would still make them valid tools for well-being. Furthermore, there's an important difference between the traditional placebo effect and the results reported by mudra practitioners. A placebo generally requires the person to consciously believe in the treatment's effectiveness. But many people who try mudras for the first time with no specific expectations still report definite physical sensations during the practice. Sensations of warmth in the hands, changes in breathing, shifts in heart rate, muscle relaxation. effects that suggest something physical is actually happening regardless of the person's beliefs. And here we come to perhaps the most interesting aspect of all this: preserved knowledge. Because the ancient traditions didn't treat mudras as isolated techniques, they were part of a larger system of self-knowledge, a way to develop awareness of how the body really works. Experienced practitioners describe a gradual process where, through regular practice, they begin to notice bodily signals that normally go unnoticed. Subtle shifts in energy, patterns of muscle tension, fluctuations in mental state that precede health problems. It's as if mudras function as a form of training, not just to influence the body, but to develop sensitivity to one's own internal processes. A skill that, once developed, extends far beyond the formal practice of the gestures. And maybe that's what the ancient texts were really preserving, not just specific techniques, but a different approach to understanding and interacting with one's own body, an approach where the human being isn't seen as a machine that sometimes breaks and needs to be fixed, but as an integrated system capable of conscious self-regulation. This perspective might seem radical to our modern culture, accustomed to delegating all healthcare to external specialists. But maybe it's not so radical after all. Maybe it's just a return to something we've always known, but which was lost along the way. Because in the end, regardless of all the scientific explanations and energetic theories, there is something simple and undeniable about mudras. They invite us to stop, pay attention to our own bodies, and dedicate a few minutes of our day to consciously taking care of ourselves. And maybe that's what really matters, not whether chakras literally exist or if energy channels can be scientifically measured, but whether these ancient gestures can help us develop a more conscious and caring relationship with our own bodies, a relationship where each person gradually becomes more capable of perceiving what they need to maintain their own balance and well-being, where ancient techniques become modern tools for self-knowledge and self-care. This isn't magic. It's simply a different kind of education, an education that the ancient traditions carefully preserved and that we may now be ready to rediscover.